we're seeing that losses globally from physical effects of climate change are increasing about 5 to 7% a year in real terms, right? And so this is becoming more and more of an issue, whether you're a property owner, asset owner, or indeed whether you're a business with a complex supply chain.
Hi, I'm Lauren Espin, and welcome to the Optimistic Outlook podcast. What if climate risk is no longer just an environmental issue, but a core business risk shaping how companies invest, operate, and compete? In this episode, Erika Gupta, Global Head of Sustainability at Siemens Financial Services, sits down with Harry Morrison, Partner, Sustainability and Responsibility at Bain Company, to explore how physical climate impacts are quietly reshaping balance sheets, supply chains, and long-term profitability. Why are global losses from climate-related events continuing to rise? If resilience is now a top executive priority, why is investment in adaptation still so low? And who inside an organization is actually responsible for preparing for what's coming? You'll hear how extreme heat, drought, and water stress can erode margins in ways that don't always make headlines, how rising insurance costs are changing the economics of real assets, and how new advances in data and AI, from geospatial risk mapping to medium-term weather forecasting, are giving companies tools they've never had before. But this isn't just about risk. It's about opportunity. Let's dive in.
Harry, thank you again so much for joining me today. It's wonderful to have your expertise on this show and really glad to hear your perspective on resilience. And that's really the hot topic for today. I mean, we're seeing so many changes in terms of supply chain disruptions, physical changes, and how do you really see that shaping business decisions today?
Yeah, hi, Erica. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here. And you're absolutely right. This topic of risk, resilience, and adaptation has really rocketed up the agenda for business leaders over the last couple of years. I think there's a few different reasons for that, right? So one is that the physical effects of climate change are becoming very apparent to people, whether that's seeing the effects of fires in California or floods in Asia or heat stress on agriculture. There's many different instances of this around the world. So the physical reality of climate change is starting to hit. And I think at the same time, what we've seen is that there's a recognition amongst business leaders that our mitigation efforts are behind track, right? If we look at the global negotiations, we obviously were all aiming for a 1.5 degree world, but the reality of the policy environment is maybe 2.5 degrees that's more plausible. So many people are starting to say, well, actually, we're going a bit slower than we hoped on reducing emissions. And that means the urgency and the speed with which these physical issues are going to approach is only going up. And so I think that's really focusing the mind. At the same time, just to give you another stat, we're seeing that losses globally from physical effects of climate change are increasing about 5 to 7% a year in real terms, right? And so this is becoming more and more of an issue, whether you're a property owner, asset owner, or indeed whether you're a business with a complex supply chain that might be affected by these different topics.
I saw a stat recently that only maybe 1/3 of businesses are really prepared to adapt to the changes that we're seeing in climate risk. Why do you think that is? Why is there a difficulty in really prioritizing action around adaptation and resilience?
Yeah, look, I think we see that a lot. We did a survey with operations leaders last year, and they told us that actually their number 2 priority after cost reduction was resilience. About 41% people rating it as extremely important. So there's an intellectual knowledge of the importance of resilience and a desire to do something about it. But at the same time, there is quite a slow level of action. The percentage of financing going into adaptation as a share of total climate finance is in single digits, right? And I think for many people, it's because it feels like it's always tomorrow's problem. It's maybe something they feel that their insurance is in place to cover, and so they don't feel the need to take that direct action. And I guess it's only when the issue arises you suddenly realize how important it is. And I think that for many organizations, it's that question of who's responsible that is actually really important. It's one of those topics where the buck can get passed between different leaders. The other thing I'd say on this is that the pace of change is not consistent across industries. If you talk to the insurance industry, of course, they have modeled physical risk for many, many years. And indeed, banks who've got a long-term lending portfolio are very on top of this issue. So that's quite mature in that sector. If we think about real estate investing and infrastructure, the maturity is a bit behind, but it's going up really fast because you've got such a massive exposure. And then if you think about the corporate world, manufacturing businesses, big supply chains, etc., well, they are perhaps at the start of the journey right now. So actually we see a real range in maturity across different industry sectors, depending on their level of historic exposure to the issue.
Yeah, that's certainly something that, being part of the financial services organization, we look carefully at in terms of the significant, severe individual, let's say, disasters. But we're also seeing this emergence of these slower effects of climate change eroding profitability for companies as well. So when we look at things like extreme heat or drought to have water stress driving up water costs. Can you talk a little bit more about what you're seeing to those slower acting changes?
Yeah, for sure. It's true. If you're a property owner, a real estate investor, for example, it's the acute issues, it's the physical damage to your property that you often notice first. But if you're thinking a bit more broadly about companies with long manufacturing supply chains, dependence on raw materials, for example, then often it's the more chronic effects that impact them and can create a shift in the economics of the industry. So it's the fact that crop yield is going down and then you get a massive price spike. And then you see that come through the value chain as inflation, in effect, just like you've seen, for example, with cocoa very prominently in 2024. So it's these types of effects that are often top of mind for companies. Supply chain bottlenecks is another one where you find that you've got a dependency on a particular piece of infrastructure or a port, or in Germany you had the issues with the level of water on the Rhine being low and therefore transport being disrupted. And these effects often are maybe less about the damage, they're about the indirect impact in terms of either business continuity or that inflationary cost pressure. And that's often how it shows up. And it's a bit of a more complex question to then understand and work out the right mitigations. But that is what business is grappling with right now.
I think you really drive businesses to take action to address these risks. Like, how would you pitch to a CEO that it's time to make an investment here?
Yeah, look, at Bain we see there's really three big things that our clients need to worry about. The first is visibility, so really getting a sense of the scale of the risk. The second is clarity about the levers that are available, the solutions. And third, it's about the people and governance. So let's cover all of those. On visibility, there's an enormous array of data and analytics that are now becoming available. And so getting a proper handle on where are the hotspots of exposure, what's at stake is the key first step. We just did a bit of work with a big real estate investor. And what was fascinating there was to map all of their portfolio of property around the world and to understand not just the level of exposure and the level of inbuilt resilience, because of course some properties have been designed to very high standards already, but to compare that as well to the local insurance market response. Is the insurance pricing in climate risk, or maybe it hasn't reacted yet? And then you can start to see, well, which property has got a problem? It's high exposure and the market's beginning to move. And where, therefore, do we want to build more resilience into the property portfolio? Where do we potentially want to divest, actually, whilst we still got a great value and before people wake up to the level of risk inherent? So getting that sort of visibility and then using it to map the opportunity space is really key. Second thing is then clarity on the levers. What are you going to do either to reduce the exposure or potentially to give you more ability to bounce back so that when the risk happens, it has a smaller effect. And there, it's really about looking upstream at your own operations and potentially downstream as well. So lots of different levers you can pull. And then on the final one, people and governance, what we see is that there's often uncertainty. Is this something that the chief risk officer should worry about? Or, Is it something for supply chain, or is it something for the investment manager, or for sustainability, or for the CFO? And so getting the right forums in place, the right responsibilities set up, and being clear, therefore, about how to address it organizationally, I think is really key as well. So yeah, visibility, clarity of solution space and governance is what I'd say to prioritize.
So a topic that we hear all the time now, and that's data and AI, right? How is that really being used to help address this challenge? Are you seeing tools and more, let's say, data available in order to assess the risks and make clarity around this?
Yeah, very much so. And it's a super exciting area where I think that, AI and analytics tools are really bringing new potential to address the issue. So I'll just pick a few areas. So the first is in matching the climate models with databases around property and geospatial analysis. So, for example, how much elevation is there? Therefore, is there a flood risk? There are lots of tools that are doing this now really effectively on a global basis. So we, for example, at Bain, we've partnered with Climate X, who are one of a number of different data providers who are bringing all of that information together to give you a really quick risk rating on a property. And then on top of that, laying on information about the damage costs. So what's an expected loss from a different type of physical risk, and ultimately even what are the adaptation opportunities. So bringing all of that data together can give, for example, a property investor real insight into their exposure, but also what they can do about it. So that's one exciting area of analytics. Second one, I think, is the innovation in weather forecasting and the ability to think medium term. So in the past, there were lots of short-run weather forecasts, next 10 days, or there were long-term climate models. What's my exposure in 10, 20, 30, 40 years' time? Both of those are super important. But with AI and advances in machine learning and things like this, the medium-term forecast, so the next couple of months, 3 months, is getting much, much better. And that allows you to start asking questions like, based on the growing pattern for a crop, based on the seasonality, based on what's happening with weather patterns over the last couple of months, but then looking forward to the next 3 months, what's it going to do to the crop price in, say, 12 months' time? And that sort of medium-term thinking, I think, is really exciting because it allows businesses to take choices, on a week-to-week basis as to what to do. So lots happening in this area, and a whole plethora of interesting startups and AI companies that are focusing on different parts of this puzzle. So there's lots of opportunity coming up.
No, that's really interesting to see that medium-term forecast become available so that you can really make some decisions for the next quarter. And that's something we really haven't had available to us before. Do you think we're going to start seeing tools or techniques that allow us to get more transparency into risks that are perhaps harder for us to see, like our supply chain or logistics risks? And what do you see developing there?
Yeah, for sure. Just one other example, actually, on the weather forecasting one first, just to bring it to life. Predicting power is another really interesting one. So had a client who, for example, is very, very reliant on hydroelectric power. Well, if the river flow is low, then what's that going to do to the power price? And again, can you predict that type of thing ahead of time is another great example of that medium-term forecasting. On the traceability side, it's true that many of the risks are upstream. So they might be at your tier 2, 3 supplier. They might be in the production of raw materials, going back to the field, growing crops, etc. And so understanding those risks does rely on your knowledge of who are you buying from, which regions of the world, maybe which growing areas are you sourcing material from, or potentially which mines are you getting your critical minerals from, would be another example. So if you can map that, you can then overlay the risk on top of it. Now, this is quite difficult. There are lots of companies going after this space, but because your supply chain is constantly evolving as you switch suppliers, it's not always so easy to stay on top of it. I think the good news is this question is one that we face in many areas of sustainability. So colleagues looking at political risk or looking at labor standards and human rights actually have a similar challenge. So many people are converging on this problem to build these supply chain mapping capabilities and then allow us to lay the risk on top. I think the second thing about this is then, if you understand that, well, in a supply chain context, what do you start to do about it? Can you diversify the supply base, for example, across different geographies? Can you put in place some buffer stocks, for example? So can you use that traceability and analytics insight to actually plan a response that's going to deal with those issues as they arise upstream? So, Erika, from the Siemens Financial Services perspective, you look across real assets, your customers. Where do you see these weather risks and physical risks showing up in ways that your customers didn't expect? And how does that impact their balance sheet?
Yeah, we're seeing a few different things. One, with those extreme weather events, we're seeing the cost of insurance going up, certainly is one impact that our customers are experiencing. But we're also seeing more of these slower, profit eroding climate related risks impacting the businesses. So that extreme heat can really drive up cost around, say, plant efficiency. If you have a lot more parasitic power load, things are operating less efficiently at these higher temperatures. And then productivity, it can affect productivity depending on the industry that you're looking at. If you have your workers outdoors, it even increases healthcare costs. So there's a link between extreme heat and the number of hospitalizations that you see. So there's a health impact to your workforce. And we're also seeing things like drought driving up the cost of water, or even accessibility to water for whatever process you might be undertaking at your facility. So there's a lot of different things that we're seeing impact the way businesses are operating, and particularly how well they're achieving their profitability targets.
And are you finding that your customers are able to really quantify those different risks and then take some meaningful steps to deal with it?
Depending on the size of the business, some of the larger ones, yes, absolutely. Utility companies certainly have a very good handle on some of these impacts compared to some of the smaller businesses that perhaps haven't even had the opportunity to get access to the types of data that they need to really understand what their key risks are, or what mitigation or adaptation measures they can take. It's one of the reasons that we added a site resilience analysis to our DBO tool. That's short for Digital Business Optimizer, which we provide free for anybody that would like to use it. It was initially developed for our customers, but we've expanded it so that anyone can log in and use it for the US-based locations. It will identify what your top climate hazards are, and then it also provides you a list of adaptation measures that can be taken to help protect that site. So it's very site specific. We don't have something, say, for the supply chain yet, or to look at sort of those more extended risks, but it's one of the ways that we're really trying to help our customers in particular understand what their risks are and what to do. And on your side, what do you see as the key solutions for businesses to adapt to physical risk?
We come back to this three-part structure of what are you going to do upstream? What are you going to do for your own operations and property? What are you going to do potentially downstream on your route to market as well? And across all three areas of the value chain, it's then essential to think about how are you going to mitigate the risks, so reduce your exposure, and then how are you going to build resilience to actually bounce back from the risk when it happens. So you've kind of got 6 areas to play with, if you like, that we would tend to think about. Across those 6 buckets, there are a number of themes that are quite common. Firstly, it's just the physical hardening of the assets. Can you protect the asset from flooding? Can you make it more resilient to high wind, for example? So those types of change can be quite tangible for the property with your own operations and upstream, and with a fairly ready to quantify payback for many of those technologies as well. The second theme that then tends to come out is about creating optionality. So can you build optionality in your product specifications? For example, if you're a manufacturing company, so you've got different routes to achieve the same thing. So if you have a problem upstream with one supplier or one material, one component, can you switch it out? Can you build optionality in the supply base? Might be diversifying to different sourcing regions, different crop growing regions, for example, having multiple suppliers that can fulfill your needs and step in if there's a problem. Can you create optionality around logistics routes? and infrastructure. So again, if you get a pinch point somewhere, can you route through a different port or what have you? So that sense of optionality is really important. And then the final theme that tends to come out is about partnership and working with your customers or your suppliers. So if there's a problem, you mutually know how to deal with it, and potentially you're co-investing ahead of time in the resilience. So I've been doing some work in agriculture. One of the fascinating things, for example, is can you co-invest with your farming partners to have better crop varieties that are more drought or heat resistant, for example? Can you even invest potentially in the GMO around that, or can you invest in the growing practices that will build that resilience? Might be a little bit more expensive up front, but will then provide that resilience over time. So many different opportunity areas. What tends to become the discussion, and actually the hard part, is to say, well, all of these things have a cost. And quite often that cost is in tension with the desire for efficiency in operations and supply chain. And so you have to decide, not is resilience a good thing, because clearly we all want resilience, but actually how much resilience can we afford? What's the right level of buffer, of redundancy in our value chain? What's the right level of asset hardening that gives a reasonable level of protection, for example? And that's really the key trade-off, is that investment today to build a certain level of resilience that's appropriate and gives you a risk level that you can tolerate, if you like. That's the hard work that needs to be done.
One last thing I'd like to draw on is we've been talking about resilience a lot in terms of risk mitigation, but we also see this really as a competitive advantage. And can you talk a little bit about that opportunity that resilience creates?
Yeah, I think there's two main opportunity areas. The first is just building on what we've been discussing. If you have done that thinking, if you've got the upstream visibility, you can sense when you might have a problem. If you've put resilience in place in the supply chain, it means that when the problem strikes, you should perform much better than your competitors. You should bounce back quicker. And actually that's an enormous benefit if your competitors have disruption. And it's really the cost of disruption as much as physical damage that will penalize them. So I think that's one area of competitive advantage. The second we're seeing is that this is also an investment opportunity. So for companies that provide the technologies that actually enable buildings to be more resilient or supply chains to be more resilient, well, they're going to sell an awful lot more volume over the coming months. And we're even starting to see some companies tailor their portfolio and serve this new market in resiliency, if you like. We've been working with some large investors as well who see this as a significant thematic investment opportunity for the next decade. They want to put money into the companies that are going to specialize in retrofitting buildings or into flood control or into cooling or what have you, into new crop varieties. And so that, I think, is also another interesting area where businesses that are going to thrive will see that opportunity. They'll develop solutions that make sense in this new world where physical risk is a reality, and they'll either capture the market like that or indeed they'll be more resilient, as we covered before.
Always good to hear all the solutions and opportunities that are out there and not just thinking about the risks. So Harry, really great to hear, all the opportunities that can be unlocked through resilience. And it's been great to have you on today. Thank you so much for joining me. And I really appreciate that you were able to give us your perspective today.
It's a pleasure, Erika. Thanks so much for the invite. It's been a great discussion.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of The Optimistic Outlook. Be sure to tune in for more conversations with leaders shaping technology for a better tomorrow. Please subscribe to The Optimistic Outlook wherever you listen to your podcasts, and be sure to share the podcast with a friend or colleague.